Lecture 8, Fiscal Policy and Monetary Policy. So after we analyze the ADAS model from Lecture 7, we have the suggestion for the policy that if we use the monetary policy and fiscal policy to expand or to contract the aggregate demand, so we will have the change in the aggregate demand and AD shift to the right or to the left. And finally, we have the new equilibrium. This is the new result for the economy with the changes in the price and changes in the output or GDP. So now we go to more detail about the fiscal policy and monetary policy, how it affects and what determines the effectiveness of these policies. The very important assumption for this model is that when we analyze the effect of aggregate demand, so we have the assumption that aggregate supply is always ready to satisfy all levels of AD. So it means that we don't need to have the changes in the price in order to satisfy the changes in AD. So AS is horizontal and the price is unchanged. So for this analysis, we have the three important assumptions. The first assumption is constant price. The price is assumed to be constant because the AS is horizontal and always be ready to satisfy the aggregate demand. The second assumption is very related. There is abundance of production resources, so aggregate supply is available at any level, and so the AS curve is horizontal. And the last assumption is that when the price is constant, we have the new term for aggregate demand, and it is called aggregate expenditure. And so all the changes in AD or AE will determine total output, not AS, because AS is always available at any level. So now, first of all, we go to determine aggregate demand in the new term, aggregate expenditure. From previous section, lecture 7, we have aggregate demand changes in relation with the changes in the price. But now when we have the assumption that the price is constant, so we will have the new term for aggregate demand is that aggregate expenditure is the level of aggregate demand at a given level of price. So because aggregate expenditure is also the aggregate demand, so it will have the same component, the four components. Firstly, C is consumption, I is investment, G is government purchase, and NX is the net export. To determine in detail what are the factors of aggregate expenditure, we determine each component of aggregate expenditure. Firstly is the consumption. Consumption is distributed from disposable income, means income after tax. The rest of income is for saving. And so when we have the disposable income, we will spend one part for consumption. And this part for consumption is MPC percent from disposable income. So MPC is the marginal propensity to consume. It shows the percentage of income to spend on consumption. The rest of income to spend on saving depends on marginal propensity to save. And this is the percentage of disposable income for saving. And finally, we have the consumption function is that consumption depends on income with MPC percent, income after tax. We have to extract two types of tax. The first type of tax is the tax independent from income. And the second type of tax is the tax depends on income with the tax rate, small t. So this part shows the consumption depends on income. And other reasons that may affect consumption is called predetermined consumption, C bar. So this is the explanation for the first component of ID, is consumption. Second, investment. We have the definition that investment is the expenditure on machine, on new houses, or on inventory. So after firm have the decision for investment, they have to borrow money from the financial system and they have to pay the interest rate. So if the interest rate is higher, so firm have to pay more for the investment and investment reduced. But if interest rate is lower, so firm have to pay less for borrowing and they will increase the investment. In this section, we will analyze the policy in two steps. In the first step, we use the simple function for investment with no interest rate. And the second step, we will add the effect of interest rate into the investment function. Okay, so now in the first section, we will analyze this function only, not this one. The third component of AD is government spending or government purchase. And because the government purchase is one of the tools of fiscal policy, so it always be planned and predetermined. G equal G bar. Last one is the net export. Export is the demand for exported goods by foreigner. So it will depend on foreigners' income, the difference between domestic price and foreign price, and we have to convert with the exchange rate. So all these variables are given and exogenous. So we won't have export is exogenous or predetermined, X bar. And import is the domestic demand for imported goods or the good produced abroad. So it depends on domestic income. Why? The difference between the domestic price and foreign price, and also we have to convert with the exchange rate. So here we can see that if income or domestic income is higher, so citizens will buy more imported goods. And the share of income for import is called marginal propensity to import, MPM. So now we have all the four components of aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. Now we will have the sum of these four components. And we will group these expenditure. The first group of expenditure includes all the determined expenditure. For example, predetermined consumption, predetermined investment, predetermined government spending, and predetermined export minus the effect of predetermined tax. This one. So we will call this group is the predetermined expenditure. The second part of expenditure, the rest of expenditure depends on income with some ratio. So we call this group income determined expenditure. And from this section, we can also describe it using the diagram. So in this equation, we see that if income changes, so aggregate expenditure change. So here we will have that the two axes of the diagram show aggregate expenditure and income or GDP. And when income is 0, so this group is 0, aggregate expenditure will be predetermined. When income increased to Y1, so we have one more part increased in expenditure. Or income increased to Y0, we have higher expenditure. So combine this point, we will have the line for the aggregate expenditure. In this section, if we add the 45-degree line into the diagram, we will have the comparison between expenditure and income. So we can see that this distance show the level of income or GDP, and the vertical distance, this one, show aggregate expenditure. And this is the triangle with the two dimensions are the same. So the two dimension is Y1. This distance is lower than AE1. So now we can say that the distance between aggregate expenditure and the 45-degree line show the difference between aggregate expenditure and income. And this distance now means that aggregate expenditure is higher than income or GDP. So demand is higher than output. There is the shortage of goods and services. At the crossing point between aggregate expenditure and 45-degree line, we have aggregate expenditure equal output or income. So this is called equilibrium. Or if you have a higher income Y2, so at this level, aggregate expenditure AE2 is smaller than income Y2. So this distance shows that this is the surplus of goods and services, not the shortage of goods and services like this. And this model is called the Keynesian model for aggregate expenditure. The Keynesian model say that when the price is constant, we can easily determine the equilibrium in the markets. And from this idea, Keynes developed one important effect of this policy, of the fiscal policy. This is called multiplier effect. So what does it mean? Remember that we have the equilibrium in the economy. You can quickly have the equilibrium. So if expenditure increased by a level, this will be satisfied by the total output, and we can soon have the increase in income or output just the same to the increase in expenditure. And when we have higher income, this one, we won't expend more. We won't spend one part of income for consumption and the other part for saving. And this expenditure won't become income for other person, for the seller. And when this seller has more income, he or she won't spend more, delta C2. And when this person consume more goods and services, it will create income for the third person, another seller, and so on. So this process continues. And finally, we can see that total aggregate expenditure is higher than the first change in expenditure. This is called the multiplier effect. From the first change in expenditure, these changes is multiplied. And finally, we have more expenditure than the first one. So from this idea, we go to the conclusion for the fiscal policy. When we have the simple model, the multiplier equal 1 over 1 minus alpha. So we replace alpha to be MPC, marginal propensity to consume, so we can compute the simple multiplier. It's very easy. The important that you have to find what is the alpha. The alpha is from this equation when we determine aggregate expenditure. So now we go to the conclusion for the policy. When we analyze the fiscal policy, this is we have the two tones of the policy, government spending and tax. And so look at the equation for aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. We can see that if we change government spending or we change the tax, so there won't be change to the aggregate demand. Another objective of the policy is to change or to stabilize the government budget. The government budget is the difference between tax and government purchase. So if we change the tax or government purchase, so the balance of budget also change. From the equation and multiplier effect, we can find the result when we change government spending or change the tax. So now, firstly, if we change government spending, so this change will affect firstly the first group of expenditure, predetermined expenditure AE bar. And this first change will be multiplied with the multiplier. So finally, we have the change in aggregate expenditure or the change in total output is M times higher than the first change in government spending. And similarly, when we change tax, so the first change will be MPC times the change in tax. So the first change is the change in predetermined expenditure. And the next step, it will be multiplied M time. So finally, we have that the changes in aggregate expenditure is changes in tax times marginal propensity to consume and multiplied M time. So it means that if we want to increase aggregate demand by, for example, 1,000, we don't need to increase the component of expenditure by 1,000 because these changes won't be multiplied many times, and finally we can have the result change in AD 1,000. This can be explained by the model as well. So when we increase, for example, government spending by 20 billion US dollar, so this is the first change in AD, and then this change is multiplied. So finally, the change in AD is higher than 20 billion US dollar. So this is the explanation for the first effect of this policy, the multiplier effect. This is the end of the first part for lecture 8, Fiscal Policy and Monetary Policy.